At its peak in 1920, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and ruled over 500 million people. It was the largest empire in human history, an empire so vast that the sun literally never set on British territory. Yet within just 50 years, it was gone. This is the story of how the world's greatest empire collapsed in the blink of an eye. Not through military conquest, but through economic exhaustion, nationalist rebellion, and the harsh realities of a changing world order. The seeds of the empire's destruction were planted long before its fall. Britain built its empire on naval supremacy, industrial dominance, and ruthless exploitation. For centuries, British gunboats and merchant ships carried goods, soldiers, and administrators to every corner of the globe. The empire extracted wealth from India, resources from Africa, labor from the Caribbean, and land from the indigenous peoples of Australia and North America. But empires require constant investment to maintain. By the early 20th century, Britain faced rising challengers. Germany and the United States had industrialized rapidly, matching and then surpassing British manufacturing output. Japan emerged as an Asian power with imperial ambitions of its own. And within the empire itself, nationalist movements were gaining strength, particularly in India, the jewel in Britain's imperial crown. World War I was the first shock to the system. Britain won the war, but at a catastrophic cost. Nearly 1 million British and Empire soldiers died. The national debt exploded from £650 million to over £7 billion. Britain had bankrupted itself to defeat Germany, and the Empire's subjects had noticed something crucial. Britain was vulnerable. Indian soldiers had fought and died for the Empire in France, Mesopotamia, and East Africa. Over 1.5 million Indians served in British uniform during the war. They returned home with military training, organizational skills, and a burning question: if we're good enough to die for the Empire, why aren't we good enough to govern ourselves? The British responded to growing Indian nationalism with repression. In 1919, British troops under General Reginald Dyer opened fire on a peaceful crowd in Amritsar, killing nearly 400 unarmed civilians and wounding over 1,200 more. The Amritsar massacre shocked the world and galvanized Indian opposition to British rule. A lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi emerged as the leader of the independence movement, advocating non-violent resistance to colonial authority. But Britain clung to India desperately. India generated enormous revenue for the empire. Approximately 40% of Britain's overseas investment income came from India. Indian market absorbed British manufactured goods. The Indian Army, paid for by Indian taxes, garrisoned British territories across Asia and the Middle East. Without India, the empire's economics simply didn't work. Then came World War II, the blow that would ultimately prove fatal. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain declared war, and once again, the empire was mobilized for total war. Over 2.5 million Indians served in the British military during World War II, along with hundreds of thousands from Africa, the Caribbean, and other colonies. But this war was different. In 1941, Japan swept through Southeast Asia with stunning speed. Hong Kong fell in December 1941. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress, surrendered in February 1942, with 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops captured. Burma fell soon after. The myth of European invincibility, already damaged by World War I, was shattered completely. British colonial subjects had watched European empires collapse before their eyes. They'd seen Japanese forces defeat British, French, and Dutch armies. They'd seen white prisoners of war doing forced labor under Asian guards. The the racial ideology that justified European colonialism, the idea that white people were inherently superior, had been exposed as a lie. Britain survived World War II only with massive American aid. The Lend-Lease program provided Britain with over $31 billion worth of military equipment, food, and supplies. Britain literally could not have continued fighting without American support. And the Americans made their position clear. They opposed European colonialism and expected the British Empire to be dismantled after the war. By 1945, Britain was exhausted and nearly bankrupt. The war had cost over 400,000 British lives. The national debt had tripled. British cities lay in ruins from German bombing. Food and fuel were rationed. Britain was dependent on American loans just to feed its population. The empire had become an unsustainable burden. The first crack appeared in India. By 1945, British control over India was maintained by barely 40,000 British personnel governing 400 million Indians. The Indian National Congress and the Muslim League both demanded immediate independence. Britain simply lacked the military force and financial resources to resist. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan, ending 190 years of direct British rule. The partition of India was catastrophic. Religious violence between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs erupted across northern India. Between 10 and 20 million people fled their homes as refugees. As many as 2 million people died in communal massacres and ethnic cleansing. Britain's hasty exit had created one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 20th century. But India's independence had opened the floodgates. If the jewel of the empire could gain freedom, why not everyone else? In 1948, Burma and Ceylon gained independence. In 1956, Sudan became independent. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence, led by the charismatic Kwame Nkrumah. The Suez Crisis of 1956 demonstrated Britain's reduced status with brutal clarity. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France launched a military operation to seize control of the waterway. It was old-fashioned gunboat diplomacy, the kind of action Britain had carried out dozens of times during the Victorian era. But this time, the United States and Soviet Union both opposed the invasion and demanded Britain withdraw. Britain had no choice but to comply. The world's former superpower had been humiliated by its own ally. The late 1950s and early 1960s saw the rapid dissolution of British colonial rule in Africa. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan recognized the inevitable. In 1960, he gave his famous Wind of Change speech, acknowledging that African nationalism was unstoppable. Between 1960 and 1964, Britain granted independence to Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Zambia, and Malawi. But Britain didn't always exit peacefully. In Kenya, the British fought a brutal counterinsurgency war against the Mau Mau uprising from 1952 to 1960. The British detained over 150,000 Kenyans in concentration camps, subjected prisoners to torture and forced labor, and carried out mass executions. The British portrayed the Mau Mau as savage terrorists, but they were fighting for their land and freedom against a colonial occupier. In Malaya, Britain fought a 12-year insurgency against communist guerrillas. The British eventually prevailed, but only through massive military deployment and the relocation of 500,000 people into fortified villages. Britain granted Malaya independence in 1957, having demonstrated that holding colonies against determined resistance required resources Britain simply did not possess. The empire's economic foundations had also crumbled.
In the 19th century, Britain had been the workshop of the world, the first industrial nation, producing half of the world's coal and iron. By the 1960s, British industry was antiquated and uncompetitive. Germany and Japan, rebuilt after World War II with modern equipment, were outcompeting British manufacturers. The protected imperial markets that had sustained British industry were disappearing as colonies gained independence. Britain turned toward Europe. In 1973, Britain joined the European Economic Community, acknowledging that its future lay with European integration rather than imperial nostalgia. The decision was controversial. Many Britons felt that abandoning the Commonwealth betrayed the empire's legacy, but economically it was necessary. Britain needed access to European markets and capital. The final acts of decolonization played out over the next decades. In 1980, Zimbabwe gained independence after a bitter war. In 1997, Britain
returned Hong Kong to China, ending 156 years of British rule. Hong Kong's handover was heavy with symbolism. Prince Charles attended the ceremony as the Union Jack was lowered for the last time, marking the end of Britain's significant colonial presence in Asia. Today, Britain retains only 14 small overseas territories, tiny islands like Gibraltar, the Falklands, and Bermuda. These are remnants, not an empire. Britain is a mid-sized European power with a large financial sector and a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. But it is no longer a superpower, and it never will be again. So what destroyed the British Empire? The answer is multifaceted. World War II bankrupted Britain and shattered the myth of European superiority. Nationalist movements across Asia and Africa mobilized millions demanding self-determination. The United States and Soviet Union, the new superpowers, both opposed colonialism, albeit for different reasons, and Britain itself lost the will to maintain empire, recognizing that the costs of repression outweighed any benefits. The empire had been built on violence, exploitation, and racial hierarchy. It extracted trillions in wealth from colonized peoples while claiming to bring civilization and progress. And when it fell, it often fell chaotically. Partition in India, concentration camps in Kenya, hasty withdrawals that left power vacuums and civil wars. The British Empire's legacy is complicated, contested, and still shapes global politics today. Some Britons look back on the empire with nostalgia, remembering the maps painted red and the pride of global dominance. But for hundreds of millions of people in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, the empire meant dispossession, violence, and subjugation. Its end was not a tragedy, it was liberation. The fall of the British Empire teaches us that no power is permanent. Economic strength, military might, and global reach can all evaporate within a generation. Empires that rely on exploitation and coercion ultimately face resistance they cannot overcome. And in the end, the British Empire collapsed not because it was conquered, but because it could no longer afford to exist, and because millions of people refused to be ruled any longer. The sun has set on the British Empire. What remains is history, a history that we must study honestly, acknowledging both the scale of British achievements and the immense human cost of British imperialism. Only by understanding how empires fall can we hope to build a more just and equitable world in their place. Thanks for watching. If you found this exploration of imperial collapse compelling, subscribe for more history content. Next time, we'll examine another chapter in the story of decolonization. Until then, remember, empires rise, but they always, eventually, fall.